Now, Iran and the United States are holding indirect talks in Vienna aimed at bringing both countries back into full compliance with the 2015 nuclear deal that the U.S. abandoned 3 years ago under President Trump. Iran has steadily overstepped the accord's limits on its nuclear program in response to Washington's withdrawal from the accord in 2018 and its reimposition of sanctions that have crippled its economy. The two sides appear to have remained at a stalemate since U.S. President Joe Biden's January inauguration, where a return to the 2015 JCPOA was deemed a top priority. Now the stage appears to be set for the talks to renew, but obviously with some serious stumbling blocks left to be hurdled. Let's bring in an expert from the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, Behnam Bentaleblu. Behnam, thank you so much for joining us. Now, before we unpack the latest there, let's really go to a story that's just breaking in the last couple hours. We're talking about an Iranian ship that appears to have been struck in the Red Sea, a ship that has maybe a different nature than just a cargo freight.
That's right, and great to be with you. There's quite a bit of developing reporting on this issue over the last few hours, but there's no shortage of reports about the potential Iranian-Israeli tanker war, which has been emerging recently as part of Israel's responses to Iran's attempts to continue funding, arming, and equipping its chief proxy in the region, Lebanese Hezbollah, as well as, of course, trying to deliver oil illicitly, make revenues, as well as support its partners in the region like the Assad regime. That stuff has made its way into the press. What's new today, of course, is that this ship, the Saviz, allegedly it's called, has been attacked, allegedly by limpet mines. No one's talking about the attribution. Some sources are potentially pointing a finger at Israel. The Israelis are remaining quiet. But it's important here because the Saudis have pointed to this ship before for at least 3, 4, 5 years even. The Saviz has been called a mothership or an intelligence ship because it is docked outside of the port of Hodeidah on the Red Sea and is believed to support either Iranian operations, the provision of men and munitions, as well as the Houthis in the country of Yemen, which Tehran supports materially and politically.
Definitely a lot to still unpack there, but now let's shift back to those nuclear talks. We spoke just a month ago, Behnam, about the stalemate and wouldn't say that too much has changed since then, but what do you see coming out of this indirect dialogue in Vienna?
Well, these talks are early. These talks are exploratory, so that part must be said. Expectations must be dampened, but there is, I think, a change, a discernible change in the U.S. position. And rather than talking about going for a longer and stronger deal, things that the Biden administration told Congress and the American public very early on this year, it seems to have been narrowing the parameters down and currently seems interested in just resurrecting that 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA. It makes little sense doing this strategically, not just politically, but strategically, because this deal is fast expiring and its two most important adherents, the U.S. and Iran, are outside of the deal. So spending your diplomatic capital as well as your sanctions leverage on this deal, which did not achieve its own ends, I think is a mistake. But I think we're seeing an interest in Washington in getting it back together as soon as possible, because the U.S. does not seem to be interested in issuing further sanctions to deal with Iran's ongoing nuclear violations.
Right, but it does appear as though the whole issue of sanctions hasn't necessarily changed. Iran is still saying, at least in the recent days, that it does want the sanctions to be completely alleviated. For the last we heard from the U.S. press office of the Biden administration, that they're looking at stages of relieving sanctions or alleviating sanctions. Is that going to remain the sticking point, and is that really the main obstacle, or can that be overcome?
It certainly looks like in the short term that is the main obstacle. The Iranians, despite showing up today in Vienna for indirect diplomacy, you could say, with the U.S. as well as the other nuclear negotiating partners there, inclusive of the P5+1, the Iranians are adamant about getting upfront sanctions relief, and they seem to want wholesale sanctions relief, defined not just by nuclear sanctions, but by the broad array of sanctions the Trump administration imposed on Iran, given the nuclear and non-nuclear nature of Iran's asymmetric threat. So they are adamant that they want this relief upfront, even after today, and so that's going to be a sticking point for the two tracks that appear to have come out of today's talks.